Welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to talk about selection tools, review sources, and also very briefly about the future of reference. So School Library Journal is a basic review journal that covers children's, young adults. It's for school libraries, public libraries. They review a large number of the books that are published throughout the year. They review them whether or not they're positive or negative reviews, although you won't see you just see a review saying it might not be work for your library, or they're not really harsh reviews. It includes a reference section, reviews reference material. In this case, this is an old one, but this example had 9 reference books, including the encyclopedias of fairies in world folklore and mythology for grades 9 plus, which they note in which they note inconsistencies and cross-referencing and say is only for those with intense interest in fairy lore. So probably more something that you might use in a college, maybe a community college. And the Animal Planet Atlas of Animals for grades 2 to 5, which they say has beautiful full color photos and illustrations, but is more for browsing than research, as there's limited information on each animal. So you can see how you can get a little idea if this book might work well for you. What I also like to do is go into Amazon and look a little bit further. If I find something that interests me by the description, then a lot of times in Amazon you can see the cover a little more in depth. They don't put the covers for every book here, and you can look at the first couple pages sometimes, so it's a nice way to extend your review if you are interested in something. Booklinks is another review source. It's published by Booklist, but focuses on children's material. In this case, this is a Science and the Common Core issue that will it's older. I think this is 2013 also, but they do special issues that would be of interest if you're trying to expand your nonfiction collection. Voya is a review journal it's called Voice of Youth Advocates, and it's basically for 12 to 18, I think. And you can go on here and look at some of their book lists and some columns. You can't I think you have to subscribe to get to the reviews, but there's some information here, including things like this nonfiction honor list, which they do yearly, and just highlights some books that they found particularly good for young adults. You also can look at the committee that picked these books, and there's little explanations, so that's a nice resource. Kirkus is an interesting resource. Kirkus always seems to be off in its own world and gives you a little different perspective, and you can get, I think, most of their book reviews without subscribing. I didn't find a way that I could search for reference books, but if you can go in here and look at if you want a second opinion on a book, like if you wanted to look up that animals book because you wanted to see what Kirkus had to say if they liked it, and when SLJ didn't like it, this is a good place to go. What's interesting, I wanted to point out Voya has a interesting rating system for their regular nonfiction books and fiction books, where they rate it by both popularity and quality. However, the reference books, I found this because I was trying to find that rating. It says they don't provide ratings. This is from their reviewer instructions. So the reviewer is supposed to provide a content summary, discuss what the book's value will be, mention other books that already meet the information needs, and state if the book is a one-stop source that brings together information scattered throughout other books. So you can get an idea without a rating of what would be in this reference work. But Kirkus, like I said, is a little more direct, a little more honest, I guess, in some ways. For example, this review of Animals Everywhere, which is, I think, a newish book. 2013. No. They're recommending something from 2013. Oh, this is a 2013 book. I don't know why 2013 is my year, but they're saying this is a populous but indigestible flurry of paper collage animal portraits, not exactly enhanced by inept rhymed commentary and pop-ups. So they're a bit more honest and not afraid to say exactly what they think in their reviews, which is kind of interesting. So this leads me to my next thing that I want to say about understanding your review source. And one of the things to think about is, are reviews signed? Are the people willing to say what they're saying and put their name to it? And I believe Kirkus reviews are not signed, which is probably allows them to be a bit more direct. Who does the reviews? Different people. Sometimes it's practicing librarians, sometimes it's literature critics or staff. Book Links, it's done by the staff. School Library Journal, you have to have been a practicing librarian, public or school, or an educator in order to do reviews. Either you are one now or you were one in order to do reviews for School Library Journal. Also, it's good to understand if the review source is comprehensive or selective. Something like Kirkus tends to be comprehensive. They do review most material that comes out, School Library Journal. Also, something like Hornbook, and I didn't really mention Hornbook here because they don't do a lot of reference reviews, but they do some nonfiction reviews, but they're more selective and they won't have anything in there that they're not recommending. Whereas Kirkus obviously will have stuff that they don't recommend, and School Library Journal also. So it's good to know what your source will give you. If you don't know that you're only looking at a selective, positive group of books, that might color how you read it. There's also books such as Guide to Reference Material for School Library Media Centers and the recommended reference books for small and medium-sized libraries and media centers. This one's updated every year. I didn't get the most recent one for this. I don't think this is updated as often. These can be really good if you're supplementing, increasing your reference and research resources, if you're starting from scratch and need to see a broad view of what's available out there, not just what the newest ones are that are being reviewed each month. It can give you some good ideas to look through something like this. And these are resources that you probably want to share among different, if you can share it with your public library, if you can share it with several other book libraries in your district, because these tend to be a little more expensive. And maybe you get the new one this year. If you decide you want something like this, and the other library gets it the next year, sometimes you just don't have the budget for something like this. There's also great resources for finding websites and other electronic resources. So AASL every year does best websites for teaching and learning, and they give you the name of it and a little blurb about what it does and what grades it's good. You can see grade 6, grades 2 to 5, K and up. So this is a good resource for finding new resources. Like, it's not just the websites could be, and so it could be more software type of thing, or it could be reference, particularly Boom Writer might not be something that you'd necessarily look to as a reference resource, but certainly I see down Newseum, which is a physical museum in Washington, D.C. about news. So there will be some interesting information there. And you can see they've given it little codes: include, collaborate, explore, engage, etc. ALSC, the Association for Library Service to Children, which is also ALA, does this great websites for kids, and they've broken it down across the top into different categories. And you can see here for social studies, there's some interesting categories. Here's Ben's guide that we looked at, and CIA for Kids games. And Bureau of Labor Statistics, I'm going to have to add that to my Government Resources Week. So that's and Harry Potter Alliance, cool. So that could be a good resource for additional websites and resources for your students and teachers. Back to books, this is a website that gives you book recommendations. This is the National Council for Social Studies. You can't access the most recent ones. They keep them, you have to be a member. So if you have a teacher, a social studies teacher who happens to be a member, maybe you can sponge off of them. But they have a little legend here for each of the reviews that they have for these recommended books, and they give you, the basic information, title, etc., small summary, who wrote it. QPR is the person who wrote this one, and then also the grade level, which they've generalized as, and it says up here, you probably can't see this, primary, K to 12, I is intermediate, 3 to 5, middle, 6 to 8, high school, 9 to 12. And then they have thematic. So this one, the strands of the social studies curriculum that this book would be appropriate for. So here we have 3, 6, and 10. So we have people, places, and environments, power, authority, and governance, and civic ideals and practices. So that's a nice little resource that gives you new material each year. And then Science Trade Books is another association that puts together, the National Science Teachers Association puts together these lists of science books. They don't have as nice little strands and ages and stuff as the social studies one, but this is a really good resource. I think that actually they must organize these by I guess they just have them alphabetical, so you'll have to look up what grades that they work for. So with collection development in your reference collection, and even in your, particularly if you have a separate or non-circulating reference collection, you should have, as part of your collection development policy, some wording of reflecting how you choose your reference material and your research material, well, basically your reference material, including your electronic resources. And this is a policy that if you're challenged for a book or an electronic resource you've decided to include, I think I talked to you about the EBSCO resources that were being challenged through some ridiculous, they're finding their way into EBSCO and then somehow going out of what the children are in and going to somewhere else and finding information on, sexual information, sexual diseases, whatever, which would be in the database, but they had to go through 17 different things to get to it. So if you have a reason why you chose EBSCO and it's, it would have fallen under, not EBSCO in particular, would have fallen under what you look for when you're doing collection development. If you have a written policy that can help you, guide you as to what you choose and help you talk to people about why you have things in your library, it can be useful and should include references. You also have to decide whether you want a circulating or non-circulating reference collection. Used to be, as I think I said in another lecture, non-circulating was the standard. Everybody had a reference collection that did not go anywhere, and it was always there for when students wanted to come in and look something up. You didn't have to worry about running out of that resource because it was there. But now that's not necessarily how the library is used. Those kind of facts could probably be found on the internet. Some people make everything circulated and interfile them with their nonfiction collection. Some people keep some reference books non-circulating so that they are still there if needed, and this could be maybe particularly important if you don't have much access to databases and you don't want the kids just using Google. you can interfile them with the regular nonfiction collection and still have them be non-circulating. They would be under their Dewey number. And that's something you have to, that will depend on how your library is used and who's using it, and whether you have somebody who insists that you have to keep a reference because that's the way it was always done, or whether you can, and maybe that works for that school. There may be a school where a reference collection that doesn't circulate, that's all together, works really well for a certain curriculum, and you want to keep it. So you'll have to decide what works best for your school. The other thing is, if you have a non-circulating collection, or even if you have students coming in to use material but not take it out because they're doing research projects that you don't want it to be missing for the next class, it can be difficult to track the use in order to have a rationale for buying these, to say they are being used. You can ask students not to reshelve the books after using, either as a practice all the time or for a period of time that you can extrapolate out from, and you can kind of count how many books are left out. So if you do it for 2 weeks in one semester, or 2 weeks a month, or 3 days a month or something, and then say, okay, this is an average amount over those 3 days, this is how much my books are being used, my reference non-circulating is being used. You can also get some idea of their use by their condition. If the book flops open to a particular page, or if you can tell the spine is cracked, or you see that it's just been used, then you can't tell how many, you can't really quantify it, but you know that it's being used by students. You'll often see almanacs if students have free time to go in, that they're just beat up, like the Guinness Book of World Records always seems to be really heavily used because students just like to browse in them. So databases are expensive and getting even more expensive. There is some backlash to database expenses, particularly among colleges, because it can really eat up a budget very quickly. And there's a lot of talk about how if you're doing research and you're in a college or university, you don't get paid when your article gets published. It goes into these journals, and usually even the editor is a non-paid position. However, the journal, when it goes into these databases and the full text is made available, these large conglomerates like Elsevier is the one that seems to be the worst, because they have a lot of the medical and scientific databases, will charge a humongous amount for these databases, for access to these databases, that is really starting to become a difficult thing for universities to keep up with. As a matter of fact, I think there was one university that just made a decision not to subscribe to Elsevier anymore, which can make it difficult if you need the journals that only Elsevier may have. I know probably as you've done some research for this class or for other classes, you'll see that we don't have an article here and we have to interlibrary loan it, but if you just don't, you can't rely on interlibrary loan for everything, in part because the other libraries do charge you and there is expense in getting these. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see going forward how that's going to break out, what the economic model will be for database expenses. But don't forget that you can bypass some of those expenses by making sure you take advantage of whichever databases in JerseyClicks is appropriate for your students, because they're free. The state library pays for those out of funds that they get from the I think it's both federal and state funds, and shares them with everybody. So don't forget that you can access them and there should be, everybody should be able to find at least one database on there that will work for their school. So you should never have a school with no databases unless there's no computer in your class, in your school at all. And it'll be interesting to see what reference will look like in the future. How will these economic expenses look? How will they play out? We've already seen a change from traditional library reference sections to less use of that and more online use. We've talked about how to make yourself available, and is sitting at a desk. Not that you necessarily will do that as much in your school libraries, but it's certainly the model for a public library. Is sitting at a desk the best way to be interacting and providing reference? And you may have seen this with your reference interviews. If you walk into the desk, how does that feel? What does that mean that there's a barrier between you two? With iPads now, you can have a pretty full-on computer to walk around with, and do searches while you're in the stacks. You can take the catalog with you instead of standing at the stacks and then writing down a number and going into the stacks. You can continue to look it up with an iPad. How will social media change reference? There is some chat reference, but are there going to be other ways to use social media to change what a reference interview will look like in the future? So it'll be interesting to see how reference of the future changes and how we need to adapt and be more thoughtful about it as we go, or think about how we can change and provide and satisfy information needs of our students going forward. I also wanted to mention curation. It's one of the areas I mentioned, I think, in one of the readings I gave you, and it's a shared foundation in the new standards. I think I talked about it a little bit in one of the lectures, but just important to think about. I showed you the websites that ALSC and AASL providing a way to help your teachers curate information in their own for themselves and you as a library. LibGuide was one way to do this, but there's lots of things like Symbaloo, Pinterest. There's Pearl Trees, which is an old one that I still use. It's old. It's probably like 5 years old, and that's old in software time. So it's an idea. It's something to think about in terms of helping your students and your teachers organize and share their own resources, so that they can have them at hand, and also develop a group of resources that help them when they're making meaning. And it can be part of a research project, part of information literacy, part of something like Goodreads, if you're familiar with that, is kind of a curation of what you've read. I'm part of the part of the book challenge. Every year they do a book challenge where you set a goal for yourself. I set a goal of 100 books because I read picture books and I'm a little bit behind, but it's a curation in a way, because each book I read I enter into Goodreads, and so I can go back at the end of the year and look at what I've read, and it helps me remember. I also use Evernote, which is a way of collecting on the cloud, collecting resources and making notes on the books that I've read. It can also be used for research. So curation is definitely an area that's going to be more and more important going forward, especially as we get fewer if we don't have those resources sitting behind our reference desk or sitting right there, and we want to use good sources, having our own curated area of websites, go-to information areas, not just Googling, but stuff that you've already looked at and evaluated. It's curating for yourself as a librarian is also important. The other area where curation is going to be important is helping your teachers as open educational resources become more popular. With open educational resources, anyone can legally and freely copy, use, adapt, and reshare these resources. They range from textbooks to curricula, syllabi, lecture notes, assignments, tests, projects, audio, video, animation. So they're materials in the public domain. They may have been created under the Common Core, the common licensing that we talked about last week or the week before. So if your school decides to go to open educational resources in order to cut down on the costs of textbooks and just the sheer moving and keeping track of textbooks, some librarians actually have that as part of their job, collecting all the textbooks at the end of the year and giving them out at the beginning of the year. So these open educational resources might make students' backpacks lighter and budgets stretch a little bit farther. So it's something to explore going forward. And I just want to mention, I'm going to be sending you an email about Chalk and Wire. You have four things you have to do for Chalk and Wire. For this course, you need to upload your reference interview paper to under Assessment 9 inquiry project. You need to launch a PDA, a professional dispositions assessment, for me to evaluate you, and you need to do a self-assessment of yourself with your professional dispositions assessment, self-assessment. I'm going to, this is just to mention to you that this is coming up in the before the end of the semester, and I will be sending you information very soon about the particulars to this. Some of you may not know yet what Chalk and Wire is, and don't worry about it. We will go through that. Next week is like a 2-day week or something, so I'll post a short recap lecture. You'll have optional comments. The LibGuide is due December 18th. I don't really care if I get it on the 18th. You can give it to me on the 21st, 22nd, whatever works for you. I think the 21st is the last day of the semester, so shoot for that if you can. If you're going to be much later than like the after Christmas, let me know. Remember, when you do the LibGuide, keep it private. You're doing it as unpublished. You need to make it private and share the URL. Do not copy and paste the URL, but to follow my directions that I gave you and share. Click to obtain a URL to share it with, because otherwise I cannot see it. If you just click across the top, it has to be that generated URL. And then the other Chalk and Wire thing you're going to do, I said there were 4 things, is when you're finished with the LibGuide, it's going to go into Chalk and Wire also. Just you're going to paste in this shared URL. I will be giving you more information in emails about Chalk and Wire. So that is it, and I will see you on the discussion board. Thanks.